An elderly woman escaped the nursing home, then saw her house being auctioned. For 6 months, her own son had kept her locked away 3 towns over, telling the staff she had dementia, telling her siblings she wanted to be left alone, and telling her that the house she'd lived in for 52 years was just being renovated. None of it was true. He needed the money to pay off a secret so dark it would destroy everything she thought she knew about her own child. She had 72 hours to stop him. No phone, no money, and only one person who believed her, a 23-year-old night shift worker who risked everything to help her escape. What happened when she walked into that auction and looked her son in the eye? The house at 247 Maple Ridge Lane had been built in 1962 by a contractor named Bill Holloway. He'd constructed it with his own hands during the evenings and weekends, working his regular job during the day, coming home covered in sawdust and determination. His young wife Eleanor would bring him lemonade and sandwiches while he framed the walls, and she'd sit on an overturned bucket watching him work, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. That baby was Margaret. She'd grown up in that house, taken her first steps on the hardwood floors, and learned to ride a bike on the long gravel driveway. She married a man named Robert Holloway, and when her parents passed within a year of each other, she and Robert moved into the house they left behind. They raised 3 children there. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and graduations. Robert died in 2019, and Margaret buried him from that front porch. 52 years of memories lived in those walls. You can't put a price on that kind of history. But Dennis Holloway was about to try. He was the youngest of Margaret's 3 children, born when she was 39 and had thought her childbearing years were behind her. A surprise, Robert had called him. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe they'd loved him too much, protected him too fiercely, made excuses for him too often. Dennis had always been charming. Even as a toddler, he could smile his way out of trouble, turn those big brown eyes on you and make you forget why you'd been upset in the first place. He'd been the class clown in school, the life of every party in college, the guy who always knew someone who could get you a deal on whatever you needed. What Margaret didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until it was almost too late, was that Dennis had also been the guy who always needed a deal. Because Dennis had a problem. It started small, the way these things always do. Sports betting with friends in his 20s. A few trips to Atlantic City in his 30s. Online poker in his 40s. By the time Dennis turned 52, he owed money to people who didn't send polite collection letters, people who sent other people. People who made it very clear that debts would be collected one way or another. Dennis needed money, a lot of it, fast, and his mother was sitting in a house worth nearly $400,000. The stroke happened on March 15, 2023. Margaret would remember that date for the rest of her life. She'd been in her kitchen making tea when her left hand suddenly wouldn't cooperate. The mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, and for a moment she just stood there, staring at the spreading puddle of chamomile, unable to understand why her body wasn't doing what her brain was telling it to do. Then the left side of her face went numb. And Margaret Holloway, who had never been a woman prone to panic, felt genuine fear for the first time in years. She managed to call 911. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. By the time they loaded her into the ambulance, she could already feel sensation returning to her face, her hand. At the hospital, they told her she'd had a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, essentially. Frightening, but not catastrophic. She'd need to make some lifestyle changes, take some medications, maybe do some physical therapy. But there was no reason she couldn't return home and live independently, unless, of course, someone decided otherwise. Dennis showed up at the hospital 3 hours after Margaret was admitted. He was out of breath, his shirt untucked, looking for all the world like a devoted son who'd rushed to his mother's bedside the moment he'd heard the news. "Mom," he said, taking her hand. "Oh my God, Mom. I was so scared when I got the call." Margaret squeezed his fingers weakly. Despite everything, despite the nagging feeling she'd had for years that something wasn't quite right with her youngest, she was glad to see him. "I'm okay," she said. "It was minor. They say I can go home in a day or two." Home. Dennis nodded slowly, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Right. About that, Mom. I've been thinking. Maybe this is a sign, you know. Maybe it's time we talked about options." Options? You're 78. You've been living alone since Dad passed. Now this. He gestured vaguely at the hospital room, the IV in her arm, the monitors beeping steadily. What if something worse happens next time? What if you fall and no one finds you for days? I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you, and I could have prevented it. Margaret studied her son's face. He looked sincere. He always looked sincere. That was his gift. I'm not moving into a nursing home, Dennis. If that's what you're suggesting, no, nothing like that. He held up his hands. I'm just saying maybe we need to have some things in place, just in case. Like a power of attorney, so I can handle your bills and finances if you're ever incapacitated. Nothing would change day to day. You'd still be in charge. It's just a safety net. It sounded so reasonable, so caring, so exactly like something a good son would suggest. Margaret was tired. Her head ached. Her left hand still felt slightly strange, like it belonged to someone else, and her baby boy was sitting beside her looking worried, asking for nothing more than the chance to help. I suppose that makes sense, she said slowly. Dennis smiled. It was the smile she remembered from his childhood, bright and uncomplicated and full of love. I'll bring the papers tomorrow, he said. And Mom, don't worry about anything. I'm going to take care of everything. Next day, she signed the papers Dennis came with. All of them. General power of attorney. Healthcare power of attorney. A document she barely glanced at that gave Dennis authority to make decisions about her property. She signed and signed and signed, and Dennis gathered up the papers with that same bright smile, and he kissed her forehead and told her everything was going to be fine. 2 weeks later, she wasn't in her house anymore. The transfer happened so fast that Margaret barely had time to process it. One morning, an ambulance showed up at her home. She'd been back from the hospital for less than a week, and 2 paramedics explained that they were taking her to a rehabilitation facility for extended recovery. I don't understand, Margaret said, still in her bathrobe, coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter. The doctors said I was fine. I have follow-up appointments scheduled. I'm supposed to be doing physical therapy outpatient. The paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, the orders came from your healthcare proxy. Your son? He felt this would be best for your recovery. It's all been arranged. Dennis arranged this? Yes, ma'am. Margaret's mind raced. She reached for her phone to call Dennis, to demand an explanation, but she couldn't find it. It wasn't in its usual place on the counter. It wasn't in her purse. It wasn't anywhere. My phone. We need to get going, ma'am. The facility is expecting you. And just like that, Margaret Holloway was loaded into an ambulance, still in her bathrobe, watching through the back windows as the house her father built, the house where she'd lived her entire life, grew smaller and smaller, and then disappeared entirely as they turned the corner. Shady Pines Care Center was 3 towns away, far enough that none of Margaret's neighbors would think to visit, far enough that her friends from church would have difficulty making the trip. The building was clean enough, the staff polite enough, but there was something about the place that made Margaret's skin crawl from the moment she arrived. Maybe it was the way the nurses talked about her like she wasn't there. This is Margaret Holloway, the intake coordinator said, reviewing the paperwork Dennis had apparently filed. 78, history of stroke, early-stage dementia with episodes of confusion and paranoia. Son reports she's been having difficulty managing daily activities and has become a danger to herself living alone. Margaret's blood ran cold. Dementia? She turned to face the coordinator. I don't have dementia. I had a minor stroke. A thanks in advance. My cognition is completely intact. The coordinator smiled the way you'd smile at a child, insisting there were monsters under the bed. Patient, condescending, completely dismissive. Of course, Mrs. Holloway. Why don't we get you settled into your room, and we can discuss all of this later? No, I want to call my son. There's been a mistake. Your son is the one who arranged your admission, Mrs. Holloway. He was quite clear about your needs. Now, I know this is a big adjustment, but I want a phone. I want to call someone. My daughter, my other son, my lawyer. That patient smile again. We'll see about phone privileges once you've had a chance to settle in and the doctor has done an evaluation. For now, why don't you rest? You've had a big day. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, to demand, to fight, but 2 orderlies had appeared at her sides, and their hands were gentle but firm, and before she knew it, she was being guided down a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and something else underneath it. Something that made her think of waiting rooms and endings and being forgotten. Her room was small. A single bed, a nightstand, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. No phone, no television, no personal belongings. They'd been stored for safekeeping. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, still in her bathrobe from home, and for the first time since her stroke, she allowed herself to cry. But even as the tears fell, even as fear and confusion threatened to swallow her whole, something else was building inside Margaret Holloway. Something that had carried her through the depression as a child, through raising 3 children while working full-time, through widowhood and grief, and all the challenges life had thrown at her over 78 years. She was getting angry. And Margaret Holloway being disted, angry was not something anyone, not even her own son, was prepared to face. The first week at Shady Pines Care Center taught Margaret Holloway something important about how the world treats elderly people. Once someone in authority decides you're confused, everything you say becomes evidence of your confusion. She told the nurses she didn't have dementia. They noted that she was in denial about her condition. She demanded to speak to a doctor about her medical records. They noted that she was agitated and combative. She insisted on calling her children, her lawyer, anyone who could verify that she was a mentally competent woman being held against her will. They noted that she was exhibiting paranoid ideation consistent with early-stage cognitive decline. Every protest became proof of the very thing she was protesting against. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where the harder you screamed that you were awake, the more everyone nodded sadly and increased your sedation. And they did increase her sedation. On her 3rd day at Shady Pines, a nurse Margaret had never seen before appeared with a small paper cup containing 2 pills. "What are those?" Margaret asked. "Just something to help you relax, Mrs. Holloway. Doctor's orders. I don't want to relax. I want to know what's happening with my house. I want to talk to my son. Your son was here yesterday. Don't you remember?" The nurse's voice was gentle, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal. "He's taking care of everything. He said to tell you not to worry. Dennis was here? Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't he come to my room? He spoke with the doctors, Mrs. Holloway. He didn't want to upset you while you're still adjusting." The nurse